So Jon Cilliers started us off last week looking at how we should approach racial reconciliation in relationships if we want to look at it through a redeemed worldview. And this word redeemed simply means to have something bought back, to have something bought back for you and for us on our behalf. And as Christians, what we believe is that Jesus has bought back or redeemed our eternity. And so we want every aspect of our lives while we live here on earth to be redeemed, to be brought back to Jesus, for Jesus, and to Him. And Peter says in the book of 1 Peter chapter 1 that we have been set free from the empty way of life that is handed down to us by our forefathers. And what I need to realize is that as good as my upbringing and my character and my experiences and my nature was, as good as that was, I need to recognize that I need that to be redeemed. I can't let the way that I view the world, the lens that I view the world through, be shaped by my upbringing, by the way I was born, by the empty way of life. As good as my parents and my family and my ancestors were, as good as they might have been, it is an empty way of life unless I allow Jesus to buy it back, to redeem it. And so I want to see the world through new eyes, through eyes that God has given me, through the eyes, the lens of His Bible and His Spirit, and not through the empty way of life that is handed down to me through my humanity. And so Rob spoke last week about racial relationships and reconciliation, and I want to encourage you, if you perhaps missed out, it's well worth going and listening to what he had to say. He is a proper authority on the subject, and he is gracious and yet full of truth. Jesus is full of grace and truth, and Rob's message was full of grace and it was full of truth. And today I want to speak to us about sexuality, about how we should approach our sexuality through a redeemed, through a bought back worldview or lens. And as soon as you say I'm speaking on sexuality, people will mostly drift into one of two camps. And the first camp is thinking, good, he's going to hit the filthy, dirty, rotten sinners with a hammer. And the second camp is thinking, oh no, he's just going to tell me what I'm doing wrong. And I want to tell you that if you're in either one of those two camps today, I'm probably going to disappoint both of you, because I'm going to do neither of those things. I want to start off by talking about the difference between morals and ethics. And I think immediately people, as soon as you say morals and ethics, people are going to start switching off. But I want to tell you this is important for you. This has more importance for you. The difference between these two things has more importance and relevance for you than you know. And this is what I mean when I say these two words. Morals is basically what we believe to be right, what is justifiable or honorable. That is our morals, or our sense of morality, right and wrong. Ethics is how our morals cause us to treat people. So what we believe is right and wrong is our morals, and how we treat people is our ethics. And for too long in church history, the church has majored on morality, what we believe is right and wrong, moral and immoral, and yet we've minored and actually fallen flat in many instances on our ethics. We've forgotten how our sense of morality should cause us to treat people who are not like us, and more importantly, people who disagree with us, people who are broken and confused and hurting. We've been quick to point out to everyone who will listen what we believe is right or wrong, and yet we've forgotten how our sense of morality should cause us to treat people. And when it comes to the issue of sexuality, the church has largely had a list of do's and don'ts, and probably more accurately a list of don'ts with a couple of do's just thrown in at the back end. And there's been no narrative involved, no reasoning, no nuance, no room for conversation or discussion or relationship between people who disagree, and more importantly, between people who are broken and hurt and confused. All we've offered them is a list of don'ts and perhaps one or two do's. If I was to take a poll of everyone listening today and to say, what does the Bible teach about sexuality? Most people would say three things. Number one, don't have sex before marriage. Number two, once you get married, your sexuality will suddenly and magically become all good. And number three, God hates homosexual people. And it saddens and maddens me that this is many people's complete view of sexuality. This is what we think is a complete view of sexuality. And this is what we think God's complete view of sexuality is, because it's all we've heard for so long from so many people in the church. And it's wrong. Because the church has approached the issue of sexuality with a list of right and wrong, what we believe is moral, and we've forgotten about our ethics, how we should be treating people, the world has switched itself off to what the church has to say on the issue. And the world's narrative for sexuality is rooted in individualism and humanism. This is how the world makes sense of their sexuality. If it feels right to you, then it is right to you, right? It's about the individual first and foremost. And the sad part of this situation is there's always been a willingness of the church to point out immorality. There's seldom been a willingness on the church's part to put into words a discussion and a narrative that encompasses all of human sexuality. And because of this, we've been sexually discipled by the world. Because the people that we've considered to be traditionally spiritual people have shied away from speaking in an honest, open way about the issue of sexuality. They've just come with a list of don'ts and one or two do's. Sexuality, friends, was given to us by God to display His covenant love to us, with an emphasis on faithfulness. Your sexuality was given to you by God to display His covenant love, with an emphasis on faithfulness. And we have to start talking about it more. The gospel message is embedded in our sexuality, and we have to start talking about it more. T.D. Jakes says this, and he's speaking about the issue of racial reconciliation, but it applies to sexuality too. He says, if reasonable men and women don't speak up honestly, unreasonable people take over the narrative. Friends, if you and I don't begin to speak up honestly and openly around our sexuality, the world will continue to dominate the narrative with its themes of individualism and humanism. You might have noticed that I'm speaking a little bit gentler and less excited than I would normally speak when I'm preaching. Perhaps you might have noticed that I'm sitting down, and I've done both of these things deliberately today because I think what is needed first is for us to lower our voices when we approach this issue. There's such a temptation in many of us, as the world shouts louder and louder, for us to raise our voices louder and louder, and we get caught into it, we get pulled into and caught up in a screaming match. And I think what is needed for many of us is to lower our voices so that we can just sit and have an open, quiet, honest, kind, thoughtful, nuanced conversation and discussion around sexuality, around our sexuality. I think to have reasonable biblical conversations, we have to lower our voices. And this means that social media is not the place for these conversations. The church is fond of saying that we love the sinner, but we hate the sin. What we actually mean by that is we hate certain types of sin. And it's sins that offend us that we hate more than others, right? And so when we spend time hating certain sexual sins and yet we let others go unchallenged, what it says to the world is it's personal. We can't keep telling people that the problem is not you, it's your sin, and yet we let this equally broken sin in others go unchallenged. The world receives that as it's personal. We keep telling them it's not you, it's a sin, but we make it personal by not challenging other sins that are less offensive to us, but equally broken. Let's take greed, for example. Did you know that Jesus speaks more about greed and money than He does about sexual immorality? And Jesus is speaking into a Roman time that is far, far more sexually depraved than we are today. If you've ever studied Roman culture, you would know that most of what the Roman culture believed was sexual ethics and sexual norms can't be taught in high school today because it's too debauched, right? And it's into that context that Jesus comes, and He speaks more about greed and money than He does about sexual ethics and sexuality. And so when we hate the sin of what we believe to be sexual immorality, and yet we never speak and address the sin that resides far closer to us, the world takes it personally. Jesus said that the truth will set you free. And so the goal of speaking truth, the goal of speaking any truth, and for the purpose of today, truth about our sexuality, is that there would be a heart transformation. We want people's hearts to be transformed. We know that it's more important who you are than what you do. Who you are is more important than what you do. And yet we're so quick to judge the things that people do. Before we know them, before we know their story, before we know anything about them, who they are, we are so quick to judge what they do. See, Christianity is first and foremost about heart transformation, and then the behavior change follows. Once my heart is changed, once my heart has been transformed, then my behavior can change and be transformed. I can't force the one before I've had the other, right? I can't force number two before I've had number one. Remember, we spoke about the majority of last year around discipleship and the process of Christianity and Christian discipleship, and it's be with Jesus, become like Jesus, and then do the things that Jesus did. When we try and change people's behavior without their hearts being transformed, it's impossible. And so they only become more broken and disillusioned. Where the church has preached truth without love, the world responds with love that is devoid of truth. And so the church then preaches truth even louder. And so the world responds to love with love even louder. And then so the church shouts to the world and says, you can't have perfect love that doesn't have truth in it. And they're right. But we forget that we can't have absolute truth that doesn't have perfect love in it either. We forget these things. It's not good enough for us to say, I love people enough to tell them the truth. No, friends. Can we look at Jesus? Jesus says in John chapter 15, I am the truth. He doesn't say, I have the truth or I know the truth. He says, I am the truth. The truth is who I am. My character and my nature is truth. And then John writes in one of his epistles in 1 John chapter 4, and he says that God is love. What God does is not love. Who God is love. So Jesus, in his character and his nature, is absolute truth and perfect love. For him to do one without the other would be to deny an aspect of his character. He cannot be truth without love, because he'd be denying an aspect of his character. He cannot be love without truth, because he'd be denying who he is. He has to be absolute love, absolute truth and perfect love, held in perfect union, and that can only be done in the person of Jesus. He is both. A.W. Tozer says this, you have no right preaching to people that you haven't prayed for. And I'll go on a little bit further to say this, you've got no right dropping truth bombs on people that you haven't first prayed for, that you haven't first loved, people that you haven't brought before your Father and wept for them, people that you haven't loved, people that you haven't pleaded on their behalf before your Father. It's that love for people that gives you the right to speak truth to them. But John, there's a burning in me to speak the truth, to stand for the truth and to tell people the truth. Friend, that's good. I'm not saying lose that. Hold on to that burning desire. But don't dare do it to people that you haven't first loved, that you haven't first wept over and prayed for. You will only turn them off to the truth. Why did Jesus spend 30 years preparing himself and then 3 years ministering? I think that he spent 30 years loving people, 30 years learning how to love people so that he could spend 3 years preaching the truth to them and the truth could set them free. In other words, he spent 10 times more time loving people than he did speaking the truth, and yet the truth set them free. He spent 30 years loving people and 3 years preaching the truth to them. Friends, can we lower our voices when it comes to this issue? And can we love people before we speak the truth to them? Can we lower our voices and can we love them before we preach the truth to them? Okay, so what should we do? Where should we start when it comes to seeing our sexuality through new eyes, through a redeemed worldview? I think a good place to start is for us all to acknowledge our own brokenness. We are all broken, and that applies to our sexuality too. We are all sexually broken people, and some of us are broken to different degrees and in different manners, absolutely, but we are all sexually broken people. Did you know that brokenness isn't a sin? Your brokenness is not a sin, and acknowledging your brokenness doesn't make you any more broken. In fact, acknowledging your brokenness is the first step on a path to healing and wholeness. Brokenness is not a sin, and acknowledging it doesn't make you any more broken than you already are. That's why Paul says to Timothy, 1 Timothy chapter 1, he calls himself the chief of sinners. And then in his famous chapter to the Romans, in Romans chapter 7, he says, the very thing that I want to do is not the thing that I do. And the thing that I don't want to do is the thing that I do. He says, I'm a wretched man. Thanks you, God, for his grace. And what he's saying to these people, as I'm the chief of sinners and I don't do what I want to do, he's saying, I'm broken. He's acknowledging his brokenness. He's starting a conversation and a story and a narrative with his brokenness. We are all equally broken. Some of us different ways and different manners, sure, but we are equally broken, all of us. I think that this should always be the starting place for any discussion around human sexuality, to acknowledge that we're all broken. Because once I've acknowledged that I'm broken, I can then help people to not find their identity in their brokenness. Right? That's the goal. I want people, I don't find my identity, I acknowledge that I'm broken, but I don't want to find my identity in my brokenness. Once I understand that a lot of what I feel is actually a result of brokenness, I understand that I can't stuff this brokenness down, because when I stuff the brokenness down, it never ever has a chance to come out, to be processed, and to become healed and to become whole. And the deeper I stuff my brokenness, it actually gets down into my foundations, and so it starts to crack my foundations. I can't stuff down broken sexual feelings, broken sexual identity, broken sexual desires. I can't stuff those things down inside me, because I never bring them out to wholeness or to healing. I have to let them come to the surface, where I can process them, where I can learn to deal with them. See, feelings were meant to be felt. They weren't meant to be stuffed down. Feelings were meant to be felt. Our broken feelings and our desires, they weren't meant to be stuffed down. They were meant to be felt, to come out and expressed, where we can process them and learn to deal with them. But likewise, just because I feel something doesn't mean it's true. It doesn't mean it's right. Just because I have this feeling doesn't mean it's true, and doesn't mean it's right. Feeling it allows it to come to the surface, where it can be processed, where I can talk with someone. The church has to be a safe place where this can happen. The church has to be a safe place where this can happen. We said brokenness is not a sin, but bitterness is a sin. In your brokenness, please would you forgive people who haven't had the words or the ability to express love for you, and so have only responded in truth, and so they've offended and hurt you. I'm so sorry to the countless people who have not seen the church as a safe place to process their brokenness because they've been hurt. I'm so sorry that a lack of love has turned you off to the truth. All I can do is ask for your forgiveness. Church, we have to resist the temptation to respond to brokenness with explanations. Explanations doesn't heal our brokenness, and it doesn't help us on a path to healing and wholeness. If my wife died tonight, having an explanation for how she died or why she died wouldn't make my brokenness any less painful. Explanations don't heal people, and they don't comfort people. What people need is presence. They need your presence, and more importantly, they need God's presence. Social media and other soapboxes that allow us a place to throw our truth and our opinions at people are not the place for these things, because explanations don't heal, they don't comfort, and they don't bring wholeness. What people need for comfort and for wholeness is presence. They need your presence, and they need God's presence. As we acknowledge our brokenness, what we're saying to people is that how you were born is less important than how you were created. You see, you and I were created in God's image. We were created perfect, and yet we're born into a broken world. I'm born with broken desires. I'm born with broken abilities. Some of us are born with broken bodies and broken mental faculties, and we quite easily pick up on those things. If people are born with a disease or a mental shortcoming or a physical brokenness, we pick up on that quite easily. What I've got to keep reminding myself is that I'm equally born broken, and you are equally born broken. But how I was created is perfect, in God's image, and how I was created is far more important than how I was born. How I was created is far more important than how I was born. You see, once I was born once I recognized that I was born with a broken nature that tends towards lust, I can then no longer push into that sense of and just say that that's who I am, that's how I was born, because I recognize that that's how I was born, but it's broken, and it's not how I was created. I was created perfect and in the image of God. And so we said that the world's narrative for truth and for sexuality is individualistic and it's humanistic. Just be yourself, be true to yourself. This is a problem because I am not an objective source of truth. I am subjective, right? And so what happens is we abandon all objective source and an objective source of truth, which being God, in favor of a subjective source of truth, which is myself. I'm not a source of truth, friends. My feelings change. The Bible says the heart is wicked and deceitful. Don't trust your heart. Don't trust how you were born. Place your faith in how you were created. You want to be at peace? The most at peace you can be in any area of your life, and particularly in your sexuality, is not pushing into a particular aspect of your humanity, how you were born, but it's about pushing into and observing God's created order. Government, which is order. God's government, which is His order, brings peace. It doesn't matter what you believe or how you were born. If you want to live at peace, you have to follow and live a life according to God's created order. Friends, how you were created is far more important than how you were born. That's why we fight for adoption so hard, right? It doesn't matter if you were born as an orphan with no mother or father, if perhaps your mother died in childbirth. It doesn't matter if you were born an orphan. You were created to be loved and in a family, and so we fight for adoptions. We understand this. How I was created is far more important than how I was born. And this applies to every area of my life. Absolutely, it's my sexuality, but it's every area of my life. Created perfect, born, fallen, and broken. And on a path to healing and wholeness. Once I recognize that brokenness and express it, let it come out in a safe place, I can then go on a path to healing and wholeness. And so I've said quite a few things today, and for the systematic people amongst us, I want to give us 4 quick points of how I think we should move forward and progress this conversation. Number 1, always preach surrender before sanctification. Sanctification is the process of my life more accurately representing Christ. It's the behavior change that follows the heart change, right? We preach surrender before sanctification. And the way forward is for all of us to resist the temptation to force people's behavior to a place where it doesn't offend us if their heart hasn't first changed. Resist the temptation to change people's behavior so that you're not offended by it if their heart hasn't first changed. I love what Jesus says to the woman caught in adultery in John chapter 8. You know the story. There's some self-righteous men, and they catch a woman in the act of adultery, and they drag her out before Jesus, and they say to her, the law says she should be stoned. What do you say? What should we do? And Jesus says to them, let he who is without sin cast the first stone. And after they've left, he turns to her and he says, where are your condemners? Is there nobody here to condemn you? And she says, no, there's no one. And then he says to her, neither do I. Now go and sin no more. See, friends, before he says go and sin no more, he says, neither do I condemn you. Now go and sin no more. Our narrative has to start with, I don't condemn you. Now go and sin no more. If we can't tell people go and sin no more, if we haven't first started with, I don't condemn you. Now go and sin no more. We have to preach surrender before sanctification. Before we can say to people, go and sin no more, we have to first be able to say with conviction and integrity that's reflected in our language, our disposition, and our behavior, I don't condemn you. Now go and sin no more. Number 2, put the rule book away and embrace order. We can't approach the sexual narrative with a problem-solving mentality. So don't default to why you think sexuality, why you think homosexuality or masturbation or sex outside of marriage is wrong. Don't default to that. Start with a groundwork of a holistic theology of sexuality that starts with how all of us are broken, including the most spiritually looking people among us. This isn't us versus them and we're right and they're wrong. It's not that issue. This is a deep human issue that affects all of us. A man called Evagrius Ponticus, who was an early church father, says this: the greatest temptation that the spiritually mature face is the desire to be seen as spiritually mature. The greatest temptation that the spiritually mature face is the desire to be seen as spiritually mature. And I think the reasons that so many people approach the issue of sexuality with a list of do's and don'ts and not beginning with their own brokenness in a narrative and in a holistic theology of sexuality is because they desire to be seen as spiritually mature, not realizing that the more spiritually mature I become, the more aware I am of my brokenness. Rob spoke last week about the arrangement of God and the order of God that leads to human flourishing around racial relationships, and it absolutely applies to my sexuality. God has an order and an arrangement for my sexuality. He doesn't just have a list of do's and don'ts. It's part of his created order. It's part of his created order. Sexuality has to be presented through the lens of the gospel and God's grace, not through the lens of the law. All of us are broken and all of us struggle. Some brokenness and struggle is just different to others. Number 3, we need to engage long-form communication. Friends, we have to lower our voices. Don't just rely on a couple of one-liners that you read or heard somewhere that might sound good to you. Don't repost videos of people shouting and condemning. Don't post memes with which reduce the issue to 1 or 2 lines. We have to engage long-form conversation. And what is needed is slow, kind, thoughtful, in-depth, nuanced and balanced conversation and debate. Tell people what you believe, but then tell them why you believe it. Why has God created us as sexual beings? Why has He given us sexuality? What is the purpose of your sexuality? Remember, we want to move people out of the trap of individualism and how they were born into the freedom of how they were created. Dr. Julie Slattery says this: our opinions and actions about sexuality are based on our beliefs about God and our sexual experiences impact how we view God. Friends, there isn't a difference. There isn't a wall between so-called spiritual issues like parenting and marriage and finances and relationships and sexual issues. Our sexuality and our sexual issues are spiritual issues, and we have to be comfortable enough to address it openly, honestly, over a long-form conversation instead of just throwing out opinions at people. Number 4, and lastly, the key to the whole issue is humility. Remember, we spoke about Jesus being absolute truth and perfect love. And so the question is, how can we, and it's always been this, how can we speak truth in love and compromise neither? We want to speak truth in love and we want to compromise neither. And the key that unlocks the whole issue of everything is humility. Humility before God keeps me grounded in truth. So when I'm humble before God, it keeps me grounded in truth, because I realize that my understanding, how I read things, is not truth. It's not the absolute truth. I'm not the holder of truth. So when I'm humble before God, it keeps me grounded in truth because He's truth. When I'm humble before others, it keeps me grounded in love. Paul says in the book of Philippians chapter 2, he says, in humility, consider others. And I think what's missing in so many people's lives is considering others in humility. In humility, consider others. And so humility opens up, it makes possible this whole conversation and narrative. When I'm humble before God, it keeps me grounded in truth. When I'm humble before others, it keeps me grounded in love. And I'm able, in the person of Jesus, to hold absolute love and perfect truth together. I want to recommend a resource to us today. We don't always do this, but I want to recommend a resource. It's a book called Rethinking Sexuality, God's Design and Why It Matters by Dr. Julie Slattery, and it'll go out on our WhatsApp group, it'll go out on our sermon notes, it'll go out on probably our social media. If you can get hold of it, it's a great resource that I recommend reading. And as I close today, I want to say, if you're struggling with an issue of your sexuality, please, we would love to help you in a process of healing and wholeness and health. Why don't you get hold of us? If you're in a life group, speak to your life group leader. If you're not in a life group, get a hold of us at the church through WhatsApp, through social media, through email, phone us. We want to help put you in contact with somebody that can help you process and deal with and order your sexuality in a thoughtful, kind, loving, long-form narrative and conversation. What it means to be a Christian is that I order and arrange all of my life around the principles that I find in the Bible. I place all of my trust in Jesus as the only way to make me perfect before God, the way I was created forever, and not the way that I was born. And if you've never placed your trust in Jesus, there's going to be a button that comes on the screen that says, I give my life to Jesus. And I want you to click that button, and somebody will, and then click request prayer. We'd love to pray with you and to pray for you. If you've never done that, we'd love to help you take your next step on a path to looking like Jesus. And I'm going to close off in prayer for the rest of us. Father, I bring to you every single person here today, and I pray for those who have been hurt by others in their brokenness. I pray that they would be able to forgive and then to find healing and wholeness. I pray for all of us who are broken in our sexuality, that you would keep us humble, and I pray that we would seek counsel and wisdom. Thank you that you have designed our sexuality to be a spiritual issue, and that it's given to teach us about your covenant love and your faithfulness. Would you help us, I pray, in Jesus' name. Amen. Friends, thank you for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you in person if you're able to. Have a good rest of the week.